we'll be talking about a little bit of a less entertaining and probably less timely subject in a lot of regards, but what we want to do is go through some terminology when we talk about beef measles, because it can be the complexity of the life cycle can in some ways make it a rather complex subject to try to understand. So the first thing is to go through the terminology and make sure everybody's up to speed on that. Then we're going to talk about its manifestations or infection in cattle species, and really the reason that we deem it to be of significance in the cattle is because of the human health ramifications. So we'll go through that, and then take some time to talk about controlling it in both of those populations, from the beef cattle or from the beef side origin, and then ultimately from the human aspect again, and then give a real brief summary of the status of this entity in both in North America and globally. So, as I said, it's something of a complexity, and you can actually be talking about the same disease or the same organism and be using two very different scientific terminology because of the dual host. And so we can be talking about Taenia saginata, or we can be talking about Cysticercus bovis, in which case we're talking about the same organism. So really what we're looking at is a human tapeworm on the Taenia saginata side versus Cysticercus bovis on the cattle side. And you'll see this referred to oftentimes as a beef tapeworm, and I'll unfortunately use that term just for clarity, and I'll explain why that is later. But the reality is it's not a beef tapeworm, it's not a tapeworm of cattle, it's a human tapeworm that just happens to have a larval stage in cattle. And if you have a manifestation in cattle, we're going to call it beef measles. Okay, so if from a veterinarian standpoint, we're going to be talking about the disease, we're going to be talking about beef measles. From a human health standpoint, we're going to talk about it as a tapeworm, and because from the human health standpoint, we tend to be very egocentric and assume that if you're talking about anything, you must be talking about humans. If you're talking about tapeworm, they're going to assume you're talking about humans, and then they're going to call it beef as a modifier of it, rather than actually meaning you're talking about cattle. So that's the sort of the origin of the terminology confusion. Ultimately what it is a cestode parasite, which means nothing to most folks, but it just simply reflects the fact that it's a flat worm, and you'll see some pictures of it later to understand that it's truly flat, and it has a complex life cycle. In that life cycle, humans are the definitive host, which means that is where sexual reproduction of this organism takes place, within the human host. But you have to have an intermediate host to permit normal transmission from human through the intermediate host and back to another human. Basically, you have to have an intermediate step where another animal serves as a host for that, but no sexual reproduction takes place. In this particular case, cattle, and to a much, much lesser extent, other ruminants, serve as that intermediate host. So this is a diagram of the life cycle of it. This is from CDC, and they unusual for them, they chose to take the route of brevity here, and so they have a single slide for a couple of different diseases. And so the pig can be disregarded in terms of the disease that we're going to be talking about today, because that's actually referring to Taenia solium. So really we're exclusively interested in the cattle as being the intermediate host for Taenia saginata. Once the cattle pick up eggs or proglottids that have been shed from an infected human, once cattle pick it up, then it will get into their intestine, will penetrate through the intestinal wall, circulate via the blood stream or the lymphatics, will end up in a number of locations, but most prominently in the musculature, and in cysts there. And then if that infective cyst is consumed by a person, then the person then can develop a fulminant patent tapeworm infection, and then continue the cycle by shedding eggs and or proglottids. So now that we've kind of had a diagram of it, we'll walk through it in a little more depth of the specific stages. And so Cysticercus bovis is referring to the cattle manifestation of the organism. Again, just basically looking historically, it wasn't recognized that this was the same organism because you had two very different manifestations. So it was given different names, and on the cattle side it's referred to as Cysticercus bovis. Cattle, as I mentioned just a moment ago, are infected by proglottids, which is basically just a segment of the worm. This worm sheds portions of its body, and those segments will contain infectious eggs. And so either the proglottids or the eggs will be picked up by the cattle. The larvae will hatch, penetrate the intestinal wall, migrate within the body of the cattle, and then will ultimately localize in most situations into what we call the striated or skeletal muscle. What do we use that for? Meat. Okay, that's the beef portion of the animal. And in lesser situations, or less commonly, into the cardiac muscle. And they'll form these very small, isolated nodules that, when viable, are fluid-filled, and so they're called bladder cysts. So this is a picture of a beef measle. This is why it's called a beef measle or measly beef, is because it's not the cow that looks like she has a rash, it's the meat that has the bumps. And so this is a viable cyst in the presence of a muscle. But you can also have it, if this turns into a chronic condition, you can have calcification of these, loss of viability with them over time, and you get, but you retain a very unattractive appearance. And so again, this is what's going to be termed measly beef. So we've highlighted each of the cysts here, and you can tell that here, as opposed to this picture, here you can have an appreciation that it's fluid filled and probably more likely to be viable. Here it's grainy, gritty, and obviously rather unappealing, but from the parasite's vantage point, this is unlikely to permit a viable infection continuing. So that's what you actually see in the muscle. Once you slaughter the animal and you look in the muscle, what do you see as a disease entity in cattle? What's the clinical manifestation of this organism in cattle? Basically none. It's pretty much always an inapparent infection in the cattle. If the animal is heavily infested and they end up localizing to some rather important anatomic locations, you can get some clinical manifestations associated with that. So if it ends up in the cardiac muscle or the heart muscle, then occasionally you can see signs and symptoms of heart failure. Similarly, if it ends up in the diaphragm, then you can see evidence of respiratory failure. But again, these are relatively rare manifestations of an infection, and really you generally don't have any manifestation of infection. In terms of what do you see in the human, okay, recognize at this point we've changed terminology. In the human, it's called Taenia saginata, the human tapeworm, and again, we use the descriptor beef here just to distinguish that it is acquired through the consumption of beef. If those cysts are viable in the beef and they're consumed, if they remain viable through an inadequate cooking process, and then they're consumed by the human, then the human has the potential to go on and develop a tapeworm infection. And these tapeworm infections can be pretty dramatic, or at least the tapeworms themselves can be fairly dramatic, because they can grow to be a rather large organism, up to 40 feet. They can live a very extended period of time in the absence of treatment for this infection, so 20, 25, 30 years. And they're very, very prolific. They can produce a huge number of eggs. It's estimated about 20,000 eggs per proglottid, per body segment, and then they can shed up to 20 proglottids or body segments per day. And so ultimately the potential there is that a mature worm can shed 400,000 eggs a day. The proglottids, as I described earlier, are a segment of the body of the worm, and the interesting thing about them is they retain motility. They retain some biologic function even once they're shed. And so what that means is that they can migrate out of the human host and basically be shed even in the absence of defecation. So we generally associate this with human fecal contamination, and that's certainly the most likely scenario that you have it. But in reality, if you have a fulminant infection and a non-controlled infection, you can have these creeping out of the anus, going down the leg, and being shed at whatever time throughout the day. And so you have the opportunity for that individual to be contaminating a fairly large environment throughout the day. So this is an up-close picture of the human tapeworm. This is its mouth. This doesn't project particularly well, but there's just some small red attachment fimbriae there, basically, that permits them to stay within the small intestine of the human. They do not suck blood from the host. They do not draw anything from their attachment. That's just to keep them from being expelled from the body of the host. And they merely absorb nutrients passively through the intestinal tract of the human. And then as you go farther away, and I would wrap around down here and come, these are the proglottids out here, and as they're maturing, they're getting larger, and then they're going to contain the eggs within those. Here's a picture of the full worm. So again, you can see the head up there, and then can appreciate, here's a ruler that's going to measure about a foot there, so you can appreciate how long of a critter that is. And when you get down to the end, here's a proglottid that can simply break at that point right there and shed one at a time. So again, a very impressive infection in terms of the organism itself, or the worm itself in the human. At this point, I kind of want to take a little bit of time to distinguish, again, why we call it the beef tapeworm, why we talk about its association with beef cattle. I want to distinguish it from Taenia solium, which is the organism that is found associated with pork products. Taenia solium basically has a very similar life cycle, where it's a human host is a definitive host, and then it has to pass through the intermediate host. In most cases, it's swine, in order to complete the life cycle within humans. But the unique thing about Taenia solium is that humans can actually serve as the intermediate host as well. So if you get into a situation of cannibalism, then it doesn't need a pig at all. But obviously that's pretty rare, so the more significant public health concern with Taenia solium is the fact that when it gets into the human body and starts looking to encysst, form that cystic form, just like you would expect in the bovine with Taenia saginata, or in the pig with Taenia solium, it's looking for somewhere to form a cyst. Sometimes it will end up localizing in the brain or in the nervous system, and obviously you can get significant consequences clinically with that, and in fact, worldwide, Taenia solium, or well, they call it neurocysticercosis, because again, it's the cyst form that's causing the problem. This is considered the most common cause of adult onset epilepsy in the world. So I want to distinguish that at that point, because the next section is then to say, okay, well, what will you see in humans? Well, you're not going to see neurocysticercosis in humans associated with the beef tapeworm. That's strictly a swine or pig or pork tapeworm manifestation. So what do you see in humans with Taenia saginata? Not a whole lot. It's sort of similar to what you see in cattle in terms of just not a major clinically important disease entity. Most folks are going to report that they don't notice any problems. Some folks will report sort of vague gastrointestinal discomfort or disorders, maybe some abdominal pain or cramping and that sort of thing, nausea, diarrhea, and arguably weight loss. Again, it basically absorbs nutrients passively, so it's not something that's going to cause anemia or cause loss of nutrients by actively pulling that out of your body, but arguably it's competing for nutrients with the human host, so you could potentially see some weight loss. And on very rare occasions, you may have some rather serious complications associated with a fairly heavy burden of maybe a couple to 3 mature worms, in which situation you can get an impaction of the human GI tract. But again, that's quite rare. So generally speaking, this is not a particularly significant disease in either cattle or beef or humans. It's also readily treatable. There are a number of products that are effective either as a prophylaxis or as a treatment for it. And because of its rather innocuous nature, it was advertised as a weight loss agent, and is back in the early 1900s, and arguably, sort of kind of comes back up every once in a while through various fad cycles of saying, well, gee, you can take this organism, causes you no problems, no clinical signs, no clinical complications, but it's going to allow you to eat more and weigh less. To dispel that a little bit, remember it's got to have an intermediate host. It's got to, in order to complete that life cycle, it's very improbable that you're going to be able to consume the worm that they sold you in a pill, and have that establish a viable infection within the human. So if you want to have a tapeworm, go eat measly beef. Don't eat a pill sold by somebody saying that's going to give you a tapeworm infection. So why do we worry about Taenia saginata as a disease at all? It really comes, arguably it comes from a public health standpoint. A lot of it comes down to an economic standpoint in the beef. The infection is quite relatively rare. We'll give some numbers on that later. And again, it's relatively mild and inconsequential when it occurs. But if it's something we can control from the public health standpoint, we want to. And if it's something that gives a rather unappealing characteristic to the beef, then that's something that we're not particularly happy about either. And so those are the reasons really that we look at trying to control beef measles. And so that's sort of the next section to say, well, how would you go about that? Well, ultimately, as we said, it's got the cattle are serving as an intermediate host, and it's a host that has picked up the organism from exposure to human feces. So how are beef cattle or cattle going to be exposed to human feces? There's a number of different ways. Use of human sewage as a fertilizer, either for crop fields or for grazing pastures, either one could potentially pose a risk. The direct contamination of feedstuffs by humans, sort of the thing that gets talked about, sort of whisper campaign, so to speak, that you'll hear folks is we may have immigrant workers that are don't want to go all the way back to the office to use the facilities, and so they're defecating in the feed bunk, or they're defecating in the feed storage area or in the pasture. But again, recognize that you can pass these proglottids in the absence of feces, and so you don't have to have that deliberate of an act in order to have an infected individual transmitting it to cattle through contaminating the feedstuffs. You could also have feed contaminated by trucks or equipment. There's been some assertions of outbreaks in the past where they had feedstuffs being hauled in from a distant location, and it was at least the assertion once an outbreak occurred, it was asserted, well, these same trucks that were hauling our feedstuffs had been used to haul human sewage at some point in the past and hadn't been cleaned adequately between handling that product and handling the feedstuff. And then, at least from a hypothetical, theoretical standpoint, the potential for wildlife to pick it up from a human sewage source and then carry that into an animal feeding area would pose a potential. They're not going to be carrying that as being an infected individual, but merely serving as a mechanical carrier of that. And again, I don't know that that's been demonstrated or proven, but something that gets hypothesized anyway. How would we go about controlling those then? Sort of goes to a HACCP type of approach. Okay, where can we put some critical control points in and try to preclude that from happening? The first thing to recognize is that, well, gee, we treat human sewage, right? We very, very rarely use raw human sewage in any form or fashion for any reason. But the general consensus of folks who have looked at this subject is that we should not count on treatment of human waste to inactivate this organism. Okay, these proglottids and the eggs, they're going to retain some infectivity after having gone through typical human sewage treatment plants, and so even if you're using treated sewage, you need to have some concern and withhold animals from being exposed to that environment for up to 6 weeks. I don't think it's been nailed down to a specific date, but it's been pretty well demonstrated that 6 weeks is effective at inactivating those organisms that may have been distributed with that waste. Ensure that toilet facilities are available and convenient to all employees. Again, that's not a pure curation because they can be shed in the absence of feces, but the majority, the vast majority of eggs are going to be shed in bowel movements. From a quality control standpoint, this should the idea of having designated equipment and trucks and all that sort of thing for animal feed should be a standard practice in and of itself, and beef measles should probably be way down at the list of why you should be doing that, but I guess it can be on the list of reasons to say we're going to have a feed truck and a feed mixer and feed loader and these types of things that are not going to handle other products. And then again, similarly from a quality control standpoint, control wildlife, particularly at the areas where the animals are going to be housed, but also if we can minimize the contact that wildlife has with human waste, then you minimize the potential for them picking it up and carrying it anywhere else. So that being said, sort of the generics about what you would want to do, some of the peculiarities that we've seen is that there's been an inordinate number of disease occurrences and outbreak situations of Taenia saginata or beef tapeworm or beef measles having been manifested and linked to feeding of potato waste. And potato waste is the one that's been documented multiple times, but folks that are looking at this now feel pretty comfortable saying, well, there's nothing completely wholly unique about potato waste. We think we have these same sort of risks with any fruit or vegetable wastage product. And so whether you're talking about the slurry that's generated from potato waste, from the peels and the washings and everything like that, or whether you're talking about similar things being derived from apple processing plants or vegetable processing plants, all these different situations, you're always going to have some feed products that come out of that still retain some nutritional qualities and oftentimes get used as an animal feed, and all of those seem to pose a potential risk of introducing the proglottids or viable eggs into the cattle population. This can be managed by handling those feedstuffs in an appropriate manner, and again, for the potato slurry, it's been shown that either pasteurizing it or ensiling it both appear to be effective in inactivating these proglottids, but in the absence of doing anything, this does seem to pose a risk when you're feeding those waste byproducts. In terms of controlling disease in humans, the actual tapeworm infection in humans, it's important to recognize that all cattle carcasses are inspected, period. Not specifically for beef measles, it's that they go through the typical USDA inspection that I'm sure everybody's familiar with. And one of the things that we're looking for, the inspectors are looking for during that inspection process, is the presence of these cysts, be they degenerate or viable or calcified. And they're going to look for that in throughout the typical carcass inspection. And then if there's any evidence of a concern, then they're going to go to these preferred tissues and examine them very closely. So cardiac muscle is really the preferred tissue and tends to be the most high yield of finding these cysts if they're present. And then you move down the list of those other tissues that they can look at. Detection of one cyst in a carcass equates to that carcass being considered infected or infested, period. It only takes one cyst, that's it. If once they find one, that carcass already is going to be set aside, and then they're going to look more in depth at those preferred sites, and then they're going to see what level of burden that they feel that animal represents. Additionally, above and beyond that individual animal, that's going to cause suspicion to the entire lot from which that animal was drawn, because this is typically associated with feedstuffs, and it's likely that whatever that animal was fed, all the animals in the pen were fed, and so therefore you're going to get much closer scrutiny of the entirety of that lot, and in some cases the inspectors or the slaughter plant may actually even push for condemnation in the absence of inspection of some animals in that lot. That is not USDA FSIS's policy. That's not something that's enforceable, but that's something that may be encountered on as a suggestion in some situations. Once the animal's been detected, as I say, they're going to be examined more extensively, and once you look at all those sites, the inspector is going to make the determination either this is a light/moderate infection or it's a heavy infection. And if that animal is deemed to be heavily infected, the carcass is condemned from an aesthetics vantage point and a wholesomeness vantage point. That carcass cannot enter the food supply. If it is deemed to be a light or a moderate infection, then that animal, that carcass can enter the food supply, but only following processing. And there's a couple of processes that are effective for this. You can refrigerate the carcass at 15 degrees Fahrenheit for 10 days. If you want to go ahead and fabricate, if you don't have the storage facilities for that, you want to fabricate the carcass, put it into a boxed beef product, then you have to refrigerate that for 20 days. But that is effective. Alternatively, it can be passed for heating. Once you bring the carcass up to an internal temperature of 140 degrees Fahrenheit, the cysts no longer become viable. This translates to, obviously, thorough cooking is effective at eradicating this too. So even if you go into other regions of the world that we'll talk about later where this is more common problem, and you don't have confidence in their meat inspection protocols, that's okay. You can still eat the beef, just ensure that it's adequately cooked. So what is the status of this organism throughout the world? It's fairly widespread. 45 to 50 million people are estimated to be infected with Taenia saginata, and it has some geographic localizations based upon basically their animal agriculture, animal husbandry practices, as well as their public health infrastructure and inspection processes, and ultimately their culinary taste too, right? All three of those things are going to play in. And so it is still seen fairly commonly in Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, Africa, and in some spots in Latin America, although certainly should not be considered endemic throughout the entirety of South America. What about in North America? Well, there certainly have been documented case reports of beef measles, so infestation of beef and carcasses that end up being condemned. Case reports of large outbreaks occurring in Idaho in 1993 and prior to that in 1989. Also an outbreak that was documented in Canada in 2000. So it is here, and yet we also recognize that case reports generally indicate a rare event. It gets written up because, hey, this is pretty cool. Once you see something thousands of times, then you quit getting it published. So these got documented and got written up because they are a relatively rare occurrence. It appears to be more common in Mexico. I couldn't find any official data on how commonly it's found there, but there was a case report of a traveler as recently as 2006 who had gone to Mexico, came back to the United States, and was confirmed as having a fulminant infection, and she also linked it to having consumed inadequately cooked beef while she was in Mexico. If you start doing a search for whatever reason to investigate this subject, you really have to sort out what you're looking at from Taenia saginata from Taenia solium, because again, Taenia solium is a more significant public health risk and something that's monitored much more closely, and so most of the numbers that you're going to see are going to pertain to that organism. We do know that while it does still occur, we have seen a significant decrease in the numbers in the United States. It is obviously something that gets looked at through inspection process, and so we can get documentation of the numbers from that. And so these case reports talked about back in 1992, it was found to be present in about 18 out of 100,000 head that were slaughtered in the U.S. in 1992, and we dropped that to about 4 head per 100,000 in the United States. This was obviously mostly represented by slaughter or by fed cattle. When you looked at cull beef cows, it becomes even less common. So it really becomes a situation where you have to be feeding that animal, and the animal getting contaminated feed products, and so you start looking at what populations is that most likely to occur in. And again, a geographic predisposition to the Pacific Northwest seems to be affiliated and associated with their feeding practices there. That's where you have the use of the potato waste. The fruit and the vegetable waste is more common in the Pacific Northwest. At least that's the best explanation that they've been able to come up with at this point. An important thing to note is, are we falling down somewhat in terms of the progress that we think we've been making? There has been a large spike in cases seen in California, and unlike what has historically been the case, these have been in dairy cattle, not in fed cattle, and so you again probably have the same risk factors, the same transmission routes, but it's a different population being exposed from probably a different source. And so, you know, we've always had sort of an underlying smoldering number. So even in 2007, we had 200 cases, and then we had this huge spike of 6,000 cases in 2008, remained above 5,000 in 2009, and has certainly had a decent number documented thus far this year. So we sort of have to look and say, you know, is this something that we've neglected and maybe need to go back and pay some more attention to? And in fact, there are some folks that are continuing research on this and are somewhat concerned by these numbers. And basically what they want to look at this point is what can we do to continue to utilize fruit and vegetable wastage products to where that's not a landfill item or becomes ultimately a detriment, but it can remain you know, an asset to, particularly again, to those regions of the country that produce that without producing an inferior beef product, a measly beef that's going to get significantly discounted, potentially condemned. And then it's theorized, hypothesized, it hasn't been researched enough yet, but it's the logical jump would be that a concern that we have migrant workers who are coming in, or immigrant workers coming in, particularly into California, serving in the dairy industry, and are potentially introducing that into those populations of animals. And so we need to look at trying to educate that group of that group of people, potentially treat them prophylactically, or start talking to the dairy producers to try to make them aware of this risk and take the appropriate precautions we talked about before. So that, I think we'll wrap it up. This is a poster purported. This sort of becomes one of those slightly urban myth things. Arguably, this was done in the early 1900s, and this is a poster that was purported to have existed back then, where you can eat, and always stay thin simply by consuming their sanitized and packaged tapeworms.